All right, so buckle up. We're diving into some seriously heavy stuff today, listeners. Chalmers Johnson's The Sorrows of Empire.
This book, it's a doozy.
It really is.
Yeah.
We're talking about American imperialism
Mm-hmm.
and, like, what it even means in the world today. Johnson doesn't mess around. He throws down this bombshell pretty early in the book.
Oh, yeah.
Get this. During the Cold War, the U.S. military, they drew up actual plans
Okay.
to fake terrorist attacks
Whoa.
on Americans.
No way.
Yeah.
Like on U.S. soil.
On U.S. soil to justify invading Cuba.
Wow.
It's a lot. And it gets right to the core of what Johnson's arguing about militarism and this whole culture of secrecy.
Yeah, what's striking about Johnson, I think, is that he just comes right out and says it. That the U.S., for all its talk about, like, spreading freedom and democracy,
Right.
it's become an empire. But, and this is a big but, it's not like the empires we learned about in history class, right?
Right.
Not about colonies all over the map.
No, not in the traditional sense.
No, it's an empire of bases, military bases, global influence.
Okay, so Johnson's making a huge claim. Where does he even begin to back that up?
Well, he starts by picking apart this narrative, the one that everyone loves, that America single-handedly won the Cold War, right?
Yes.
That we won mentality. Johnson says, hold on, it's not that simple. He says, yeah, the Soviet Union collapsed, but look at what was happening inside the USSR.
Yeah.
Economic stagnation,
Right.
political dissent, all this stuff had been building for decades.
So it wasn't just American might that brought the Soviet Union down.
That's what he's saying.
So what's so dangerous about clinging to this victor narrative then?
Because it feeds into this idea of American exceptionalism, right? And it sets the stage for this really assertive foreign policy. Like, we're always right, always have the answers.
Okay.
Johnson's arguing that paves the way for the U.S. to start acting less like a republic and more like an empire.
Which brings us back to this whole empire idea.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about an American empire, it's different, right? It's not like the British Empire or anything.
Right.
We don't have colonies all over the map.
Right.
So how does Johnson define American imperialism?
He points to the sheer scale of the U.S. military presence. Like, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of military bases all over the world, every continent except Antarctica. He calls it an empire of bases. And he says these bases aren't just about military strategy, they're about projecting power, economic influence. Often we end up backing regimes that, shall we say, don't exactly have the best track record on human rights.
So it's more about strategic control, influence, than like outright territorial conquest.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting because this whole global military presence, it goes hand in hand with this rise of militarism within the U.S.
And when we say militarism, we're not just talking about having a strong military. Johnson's talking about something like bigger, more pervasive.
Way bigger. He talks about how a society can become militarized even without realizing it.
So what are some of the signs?
Well, for one thing, you have this powerful military class, like really powerful, and they're largely unaccountable. Then you start to see more and more people from the military, like high-ranking military officials, moving into positions of power in the government.
So the lines start to blur between civilian leadership and the military.
Exactly. And then you get to a point where military preparedness becomes like this top priority, like above everything else, even when there isn't some obvious threat.
Which is interesting because you'd think after the Cold War ended,
Right.
we'd be scaling back, but we haven't.
Nope.
Our military budget, it just keeps growing.
It dwarfs every other country's military budget.
What does that say about us?
It's a question Johnson wants us to grapple with.
And it's not just about the money, right? Johnson also connects this whole idea of a militarized society to secrecy,
Yeah.
which he says is like really bad news for democracy.
Oh, absolutely. He's talking about how secrecy erodes democratic values, like from the inside.
It's scary
It is.
because how much do we really know about what our government is doing in our name?
Right.
Especially when it comes to the military and intelligence agencies.
Yeah.
It's all very hush-hush.
Yeah, and Johnson gets into this whole world of the black budget,
Oh, yeah.
the part of government spending that funds intelligence agencies and, well, all those covert ops we never get the full story on.
Exactly. So how can we even begin to hold these people accountable when so much of what they do is, like, totally hidden?
That's Johnson's point. This lack of transparency makes it nearly impossible to have any real oversight. He talks about the FISA court, for example.
The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court.
Yeah, most people have heard of it, but it operates almost entirely in secret. They can authorize surveillance on U.S. citizens because everything's classified. We never really know if they're abusing that power.
It's like this whole other legal system operating in the shadows.
Exactly.
And then there's Operation Northwoods.
Oh, man.
That plan we talked about, where the military considered staging fake terrorist attacks
On U.S. soil.
on U.S. soil to justify invading Cuba.
It just sends chills down your spine.
It's a truly chilling example of how far things can go wrong
Yeah.
when you've got all this power mixed with secrecy.
Absolutely.
Whether or not that specific plan was ever really going to happen, it makes you think, right,
Mm-hmm.
what else is going on that we don't know about?
Right.
So, okay, we've got this huge military machine shrouded in secrecy.
Yeah.
What are the real-world consequences of that? What happens when the U.S. just defaults to military solutions?
Well, that's what Johnson's arguing. He says this whole militarized approach to foreign policy has destabilized entire regions.
Okay.
Look at Latin America. We've been involved there for decades, propping up dictators in the name of stability, only to see those countries fall apart.
Right.
Or the Middle East. Our interventions there have had devastating consequences.
And then there's the Iraq War, which Johnson seems to see as this prime example of what happens when military might is calling all the shots.
Totally. A war based on faulty intelligence
Mm-hmm.
with this horrific human cost.
Yeah.
And it threw the entire region into chaos.
It's a mess we're still dealing with.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about military intervention, but Johnson's analysis goes further. He even calls globalization a form of empire.
It's a different kind of empire, right?
Yeah.
Instead of sending in troops, we send in corporations, economic policies. He says this neoliberal approach to globalization, often pushed by groups like the IMF and the World Bank, has caused a lot of harm.
So it's like this more subtle form of domination.
Exactly.
Instead of direct control, it's about shaping the global economy in a way that benefits, well, us.
Right. American interests, often at the expense of developing countries.
Johnson specifically calls out structural adjustment programs, the ones imposed by the IMF.
Yeah, he argues those programs have often led to more poverty and inequality.
Like he uses the example of the Asian financial crisis in 1997.
Right.
That was the whole thing.
Yeah, fueled by deregulation, which
Yeah.
the U.S. and the IMF were, really pushing at the time.
Yeah.
And it really hit some of those countries in the region hard.
It's like this pattern,
Yeah.
with globalization.
Yeah.
Where it ends up benefiting the already wealthy and powerful.
Absolutely. And Johnson, he takes aim at institutions like the World Trade Organization, too.
The WTO. What does he say about them?
Well, they claim to promote free and fair trade, right?
Right.
But Johnson argues the reality is, well,
It's more complicated.
way more complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah, think about agricultural subsidies.
Okay.
The U.S. gives huge subsidies to our farmers, which sounds great on paper,
Right.
but it makes it almost impossible for farmers in poorer countries to compete.
So it's like we're undercutting them while saying it's all about free trade.
Exactly. It's this rigged game, and it ends up hurting a lot of people.
So after going through all of this, all of Johnson's analysis, it's a lot, right?
It really is.
It's kind of overwhelming.
It can be, yeah.
Where do we even go from here? It's easy to feel a little hopeless.
I get that.
He paints this kind of bleak picture of American imperialism and its impact on the world.
Yeah, and that's what's so interesting about Johnson's work.
What do you mean?
He's not offering us easy solutions.
Yeah.
He's not saying, here are the 5 steps to dismantle the American empire. He's doing something much more challenging, I think.
What's that?
He's asking us to sit with some really uncomfortable truths about our country's role in the world.
Okay.
He wants us to really think about the costs of our actions, has this pursuit of global power actually made anyone safer?
That's a really good question.
Right. It's a question we need to be asking ourselves. And I think he'd say it's more important to be asking the right questions than to have all the answers.
So if Johnson isn't giving us a roadmap, what is he giving us?
A push.
A push.
Yeah, a push to reimagine what's possible.
Like what?
What if true security, real lasting peace, what if that doesn't come from dominating the world? What if it comes from a more humble approach? Cooperation over coercion. Diplomacy over military might.
That's pretty radical.
It is.
Especially when you consider how deeply ingrained this idea is, of
Yeah,
American exceptionalism.
absolutely. But let's be real, the old ways, they're not working.
You're right.
We need a new playbook.
And that's what Johnson is calling for.
That's what I hear in his work.
A new conversation.
A new way of thinking about America's role in the world.
And how do we even begin to have that conversation?
It starts with honesty, humility, a willingness to listen, really listen, to the voices of those who have been most impacted by our actions.
Yeah.
And to acknowledge that we have a responsibility to create a world that works for everyone.
A more just and equitable world.
Exactly.
Not one built on military might, but on mutual respect and understanding.
Look, is the dream.
It's a powerful vision.
Yeah.
And on that note, listeners, we're going to leave you with that challenge.
It's a big one.
It really is. But it's a conversation worth having.
Absolutely.
So as you go about your day, your week, think about what role you want to play in building that better world. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the sorrows of empire. It's been real.
It has. Thanks for having me.